Okay, so we go straight into the last session on economic models, and it's my pleasure to invite Lily Hu to be the first speaker.
Oh, there it is. Okay, hi everyone, I'm Lily. So just a quick preface, I'm talking about a mathematical model today, so mathematical models on their own, obviously they don't say anything about the empirical world, and on their own they're not prescriptive, but I hope that they can give us some insights into things we might not expect, and so at a much more modest goal, I hope this talk will achieve that more modest goal. So I'm talking today about the disparate effects of strategic manipulation. This is work I did when I was at Microsoft Research with Nicole, Immorlica, and Jen Wortman Vaughan. So I think we're all familiar with the various classification systems that affect our social and economic futures. So a lot of people here who are familiar with the American education system have probably applied to college and know how important that step is for your future. There, the use of the standardized test, the SAT, bears a lot on whether you get in, right? And so knowing that a lot of students those who have the means might want to take advantage of test prep industry courses or boot camps to inflate their scores to make them have a, let's say, higher chance of getting into college. And there's a very large industry that does this. So I think that really quick example of the SAT and the growth of the test prep industry shows that classifiers do multiple things. On the one hand, they evaluate candidates, right? They look at how successful you might be or various individual and social predictors of success. But they also animate candidates, which is to say that they also encourage candidates to respond to them. They are seen as a guide to action. Candidates want to impress an algorithm. And I think this interaction between the evaluation aspect of a classification system and the animation aspect of a classification system brings to light some of the potential distortions in the behavior of classification systems that we might want to work for particular purposes, right? So that's what I'm going to be talking about today is what happens when this evaluation animation aspect of classification system, they get blurred, and what kinds of effects can they have on different social populations. From a machine learning perspective, this kind of being able to change my features is called strategic manipulation. So I'm going to give a quick overview of what this looks like in a machine learning world. So first, candidates. So let's stick with the college example. They're endowed with some natural features. That's what I would have gotten had I taken the SAT cold. So that's X. But they can also pay some costs to manipulate them, right? So they can, go to Kaplan, get that 8-week boot camp, and hopefully get a better score to improve their chances of getting into a particular college. A learner, so that's the person in charge of a classification system, might anticipate that possibility, might change the way that they think about the SAT score as a feature, knowing that the test prep industry is so prominent in certain communities. And then candidates will then best respond to a possibly changed classifier. This interaction is called a Stackelberg game. And there's been some work in this area on strategic manipulation where it says in fact, the learner can do quite well even when a candidate can manipulate their feature. And actually in a talk right after this, Milli et al., they're going to also give another strategic manipulation and fairness look. We're interested in this question of cost, and we want to ask the following question. Is it really the case that candidates can equally manipulate? Is the opportunity to take test prep services equally accessible to everybody? And what is the impact of on the actual candidates when classification systems are designed with manipulation in mind? So let's stick with the SAT example. Let's suppose there are two groups. We have these potentially different probability distributions over unmanipulated scores. And we're allowing them to be different. Our model is quite general, and we're also even allowing the true thresholds on these scores to be different. So that'll demarcate whether you're going to be qualified for this particular position or not. And here we're allowing for one group the disadvantaged group to always have potentially, because of social inequality, have a lower threshold. We're interested in manipulation, so this is where the candidate starts from a score X and can manipulate to a higher score X hat. And because we're interested in settings of social inequality, we're concerned about cases in which a particular group candidates are always facing higher costs to manipulate from a given score X to a score X hat. So here you might think certain communities have differential access to particular resources. And our first result is a reinforcing inequalities result. It says that under really general conditions, the learner is always going to choose a classifier that exhibits this sort of inequality reinforcing phenomenon. It's going to always mistakenly exclude candidates from the disadvantaged group while mistakenly admitting candidates from a more advantaged group. So let me quick walk through some of that intuition for you. So here, we have a single range of SAT scores, and there's a true separator here. We'll have them be the same for the two groups, such that everybody who has a score above this is really qualified. And then we characterize a range of potential strategies that the learner might use, which is characterized by this lower bound, which is the learner using a threshold that will correctly classify everyone from the disadvantaged group. But because people from the more advantaged group face higher costs, they're going to be able to manipulate to that threshold score from an even further lower point, right? And so this is what we call the mistaken admissions for group A. On the upper end of things, you have a threshold that's going to correctly classify everyone from the advantaged group. But because the disadvantaged group candidates face higher costs for manipulation, they're only going to be able to exceed that threshold if they started with a higher unmanipulated score. And this region is going to be an area of mistaken exclusions. So you've got this lower bound that correctly classifies everyone from the more disadvantaged group, and this upper bound that correctly classifies people from the advantaged group. And every threshold that's in between this range that the learner might want to choose is going to exhibit both of these exclusions or admissions. We also extend this to multidimensional cases. So when you're trying to get into college, in the US at least, they're not only looking at your SAT score, they might look at also your extracurricular record. But those sorts of features are also manipulable, right? And so here you can imagine in a multidimensional case, there might be different costs to manipulate particular features to be granted access. And so here we have this triangle this filled triangle that shows all the space of all those points that you can manipulate to. And so in the D-dimensional case, we kind of can trace out this line of triangles and get this boundary, this outer boundary that'll correctly classify everyone in that particular group. We do the same thing for the other group. Now the triangle might look a little bit more different because different groups might face different particular costs for manipulation, but we can kind of follow that same procedure and we get the same kind of outcome, which is that the equilibrium classifiers, when you have even D-dimensional features with D-dimensional different costs, they all exhibit that reinforcing inequalities result. So we want to ask a second question and say, if the main problem here is that a particular group has differential access to particular resources to manipulate their features in a classification scheme, it must be the case that if we pay a subsidy to that group, if we lower their costs, that ought to improve their outcomes, right? That was our hypothesis anyway. So we said, okay, if someone offers a subsidy to these candidates, surely they're going to be made better off. Well, it turns out not so fast. We actually found that there exist cases where giving a subsidy to the group that faces higher cost burdens actually makes both groups worse off in this subsidy world compared to the no subsidy world. And there are even cases where giving a subsidy makes each individual candidate in these groups worse off in the subsidy regime. So it's a really surprising result. I think we were all pretty surprised by this, so I'm not going to go into it because of time, but if you're interested, the details are in the paper. So in fact, we found that in these cases, both the learners and the candidates groups would have just preferred if nobody had the ability to manipulate in the first place, right? If the College Board SAT tests weren't so clearly gameable by paying lots of money. So in our conclusion, we want to distinguish between two different sources of potential disparate outcomes. On the one hand, there might be environmental reasons for different features. So that might be the case, and we know this actually, so there's a lot of social scientific research that shows that certain tests and also like public school funding, variety of reasons, lead to different distributions over certain metrics, but also there's this manipulation aspect, which is when we're thinking about people's differential access to actively pursuing a particular metric that's used in a classification scheme, that's also another form of potential inequalities. So we're concerned about the second one, in this paper at least. And the second is we're interested in the welfare effects of particular classification regimes on the subjects that receive them. And then we show in our paper that quick fixes, like just lowering the cost of manipulation to allow people to better compete for particular advantages, can actually have surprising adverse effects, which was something that was surprising to us, but might have potential implications for policy in the future. Thank you.
So our next talk is about the social cost of strategic classification.
Hi, my name is Smitha. I'm a PhD student at Berkeley, and I'll be talking about the social cost or negative externalities of strategic classification. This is very much the same sort of topic that Lily just talked about, but it's going to focus on a different aspect of the problem. So before we get into our critique of strategic classification, let's just make sure we're on the same page about what strategic classification is. So suppose you deploy a machine learning classifier for something people care about. Then people immediately have an incentive to change themselves in some way in order to get the outcome that they want. For example, let's suppose that some institution decides to use a machine learning classifier to decide whether or not you get a loan. Now, suppose we have some individual, say Bob, who, if he just applied as is, would get rejected. But Bob is a bit smarter than this. He might have some idea of how the model might work. And so before he applies, he actually, opens up a few credit cards, and now when he actually applies, he gets accepted for a loan. This setting is typically known as strategic classification in machine learning. It's a setting where you are doing classification, but the individuals you are classifying are strategically adapting to the classifier you're using. And most work on machine learning and strategic classification focuses on how can we make the institution's classifier more robust to people like Bob. To understand how we might get more strategy-robust classifiers, let's go through a simple example. So imagine here that the green dots are people who will pay back their loans, and the red dots are people who won't repay their loans. Now, if no one were being strategic, then the institution may use a classifier like this, which we call the non-strategic optimal. But in fact, in the real world, some of these red dots are going to try to change themselves so that they get accepted for a loan. They're going to move past the decision boundary. And so once the institution takes that into account, then the classifier they actually play would look like this. It's a shift of the original decision boundary to be more conservative and to be closer to the green dots. This is often called the Stackelberg equilibrium. And in general, most of the work in machine learning on strategic classification focuses on solution concepts like the Stackelberg equilibrium, which try to maximize the institution's accuracy after accounting for strategic behavior. In general, this work is very institution-centric, but in our work, we're going to look at sort of the other side of the equation. We're going to look at how institutional efforts to improve strategy robustness end up affecting the people who are being classified. With that said, we'll move on to the main part of the talk, which is about the social cost of strategic classification. So first, let's go through a little thought experiment. What could go wrong when the institution tries to become more strategy robust? Well, here's a really simple way to become more strategy robust. The institution starts weighing highly predictive but hard to change features, like your parents' income or your zip code. Now, these may be very predictive, but it seems very unfair to use these kinds of features weighted very highly, right? Or at all. Because if you are creditworthy, but you live in the wrong zip code, it's now extremely high cost for you to obtain a loan. Like, maybe I have to move to a wealthier neighborhood and buy a house there. And that seems pretty unreasonable. So in order to capture this phenomena, we introduce a measure that we call the social burden. In particular, we assume that every individual has some starting features X, and they have a true label Y. Y equals 0 means, for example, they won't repay their loan, and Y equals 1 means that they will repay their loan. And then they have a cost function that indicates how costly it is for them to change their features from their starting features X to some new features X. This cost could be a lot of things. It could be the monetary cost of me having to buy a new house. It could be the time I have to spend figuring out what to do, etc. We can then define what we call the individual burden, which is the minimum cost an individual needs to incur in order to be classified positively, i.e. receive a loan. And then what we define as our main metric, the social burden, is simply the expected cost for positive individuals, those who will repay their loan, to receive the correct outcome, i.e. to be classified positively. We consider this to be a measure of the individual's agency in receiving the correct outcome. The reason being that when the social burden is very high, for example, because I need to buy a house to change my decision, that means that I have very little actual agency in changing the decision that I'm subjected to, if the only way I can do it is by, say, buying a house. This is very similar to the expected cost of recurse, which was the first talk of today that Burke presented. Translated to our language, their metric is the expected burden, but over the whole population. Mathematically, all of our results still go through when using this metric. However, we think the choice of whether or not to condition on y equals 1 is highly context dependent, and in particular, we think that it's more prudent to do this conditioning on being a true positive in most cases. The reasons are a bit nuanced, so I won't go into it, but feel free to ask me later if you're interested. And of course, for an analysis of false negatives or false positives, we just had Lily's talk. So now, how does improving strategy robustness end up affecting social burden? So if you recall from our illustrative example earlier, the way that the institution improved their strategy robustness was by shifting their decision boundary to be more conservative. We showed that for a range of costs, we can reduce the problem of increasing strategy robustness to shifting some classifier threshold. So on the x-axis here, we have the classifier threshold. And we can then plot how institutional accuracy changes as a function of the classifier threshold. In particular, it takes on this kind of shape as quasi-concave. And to get a feel of what this curve is really saying, let's just walk along it from left to right. So first, we have a point here that is the non-strategic optimal. This is what the institution would do if no one were being strategic. Then, as the institution increases their threshold, their accuracy increases until the maximal point, which is the Stackelberg equilibrium. In our model, we actually also show that the set of Nash equilibria are contained within this interval. But what's important here is that the only way the institution can increase their accuracy beyond the non-strategic setting is to increase the threshold. However, what we show is that social burden is monotonically increasing in the threshold. What this means is that there's a trade-off between institutional accuracy and social burden. On the one hand, the only way to increase the institution's accuracy is to increase the threshold. But on the other hand, this also increases the social burden. And the way this works is really interesting, right? The only way the institution can increase their accuracy is by essentially shifting some burden onto the individuals, who now may have to engage in costly signaling behavior in order to prove to the classifier that they are positive. So, having now shown this sort of general trade-off between institutional accuracy and social burden, we can now consider what happens when there are subpopulations that may be advantaged over one another. So in particular, let's assume we have an advantage group A and a disadvantage group B. In the paper, we look at two notions of disadvantage. The first is when it's higher cost for group B to change their features. For example, people from group A can pay for SAT tutoring, but people from group B can't. The second captures a notion of measurement bias against group B. In fact, on a FICO dataset, we show that Black individuals who repay their loans have lower FICO scores than white individuals who repay their loans. And so that condition captures a sort of measurement bias in the features or the score that you're using. We measure the disparate impact that strategic classification ends up having by what we call the social gap, the difference between the social burden on group B and the social burden on group A. And what we find is, for these two conditions, the social gap is also monotonically increasing in the threshold. This means that not only do you have that increasing institutional accuracy will increase burden overall, it will also increase the disparity in burden between groups. So in conclusion, to just take a broader step back, what we normally focus on is this institution-centric viewpoint. In our work, we showed that increasing institutional accuracy actually ends up increasing the social burden and social gap. And what our results speak to is the need for further understanding of how our machine learning models end up affecting the people who interact with and adapt to those models. And with that, I'd like to thank my collaborators, John Miller, Anca, Dragan, and Moritz Hardt, and I'm happy to take questions at the end or later. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Hussein Mouzannar. Oh, good.
All right, great. So I'm really excited to be here. This is joint work with Mesrob, Ohannessian, and Srebro on really understanding the long-term effects of fair decision-making. So we're going to start off by looking at the typical pipeline in a selection-based decision process. So we start off with the individual, who is characterized by some set of features, and you can think in the case of college admissions, these features could be his SAT, his GPA score, and so on. So then we feed these features into some sort of algorithm that decides for us whether this individual is qualified, meaning he is able to succeed in college or not. Then based on these sets of qualifications, we make our final admission decision. So as we've seen today, multiple problems can occur in this pipeline. First, when deciding on the qualifications of the individual, some sort of bias could cloud our judgment. And work in the fair machine learning community has tried to tackle this issue by proposing multiple notions of non-discriminatory predictors. Further up the pipeline, when deciding on the decision mechanism, we can end up with rules that are different for each set of group, which might be discriminatory, and rules that have a disproportionate effect on one group versus the other. So these issues are essential to tackle. However, one key component is missing in this discussion. We really need to understand what kind of impact these decisions have on the population. The feedback cycles inherent in this process create a dynamic over time that changes the population's qualifications. Moreover, non-discrimination is rarely an end goal in and of itself. We really expect some kind of explicit social benefit. So really today we're going to focus on the final decision-making process. We're going to assume we have access to a perfect estimation of individuals' qualification and ask how these decisions affect the population. So really, and the fairness mechanism we're going to consider today is going to be affirmative action, interpreted here as guaranteeing a parity in the selection rates. So when we're thinking of affirmative action, we think of it as a temporary measure. We want to get to a state where acting with or without it is going to lead to the same decisions, meaning we have equal treatment and equal impact. And this precisely happens when we have equality between the two groups. So really, if we accept that social equality is the end goal of non-discrimination, the question then becomes, does affirmative action lead to it? To try to get an insight into these questions, we're going to consider an illustrative model of a selection process. So we have a population consisting of two groups, A and B, red and blue, and these groups have a qualification profile, pi, denoting the proportion of qualified and unqualified individuals in the population. This population is going to undergo a selection process whereby an institution is going to assign a policy for each qualification and group a probability of selection. And so our premise is that these decisions impact the population through some kind of dynamics. And so we ask, what kind of dynamics would we expect in this setting? Well, first, any dynamic in this setting is going to comprise of two movements, an upwards movement towards better qualifications and downwards one towards a less qualification. And so we make a simple modeling choice is to allow these movements to be controlled by the selection rates, meaning the proportion of qualified individuals that we select and unqualified individuals. Once we make this choice, we formulate a general dynamics that lets these movements controlled by a pair of functions, f1 and f0, that leaves this dependence arbitrary. So recent work in the machine learning community has tried to look at one-step effect of fair decision-making, however, ignoring feedback cycles. And a huge literature exists in economics that has tried to look at dynamic specifics of the labor market. So now we're ready to compare how the institution is going to behave with and without affirmative action. If left unconstrained, it's going to act optimally by maximizing utility. Therefore, its policy is going to be to only accept qualified individuals. However, if now constrained to satisfy affirmative action, by guaranteeing equality of the selection rates between the two groups, we can show that its policy, depending on whether it is more costly to reject qualified individuals or accept unqualified individuals, is going to be to over-accept by admitting unqualified individuals from the disadvantaged group, or to under-accept by rejecting qualified individuals from the disadvantaged group. And so now we're going to try to see how does affirmative action really impact the population. The first question we're going to ask, can affirmative action cause harm? So we're going to assume that acting unconstrained optimally is going to equalize the population. What does affirmative action do in this setting? Well, if affirmative action coincides with under-acceptance, equality is going to be maintained. However, we have a loss of utility that diminishes until equilibrium. On the other hand, with over-acceptance, we might actually break equality. However, when we do not, we might actually reach equality faster and with more utility. However, we really generally expect that affirmative acting unconstrained, maximizing utility myopically is not going to equalize the population. So we're going to assume that with acting unconstrained, we might get to different equilibrium points. So in the figure above, we see an example of such dynamics that lead to different equilibrium points. Each axis represents the qualification profile of one group versus the other, and each point represents the state of the population at one time step. And so these movements, these arrows that we see, are the movement of the population due to the imposed policy. And so we might end up at 9 different equilibrium points, most of which are unequal or discriminatory. And our target is going to be to reach this diagonal on which all the equal equilibrium lies. And we really want to go as far up across the diagonal to gain more utility. So now what happens with affirmative action? If we do under-acceptance, these disparate equilibriums will disappear, and we will reach equality. However, this equality comes at a price. Society will settle at the qualification levels of the worst of equilibrium. On the other hand, with over-acceptance, if society reaches equality, this is always going to be beneficial. Society will settle at the qualification level of the advantaged group, giving society, providing societal benefit. So really, to wrap up, our key message here is that we really need to take into considerations the effect our decisions have on the population. Imposing seemingly fair considerations might, in fact, exacerbate existing differences in the population. And this really begs the question, should fairness constraints really take into consideration long-term societal benefit? As we've seen, dynamic agnostic conditions such as affirmative action can bridge inequality, however, at a given cost. We really hope by understanding dynamics, we can help design better policies that navigate them towards better social outcomes. Thank you.
So our last speaker is Juba Ziani.
Hey everyone, I'm Juba. This is joint work with Aaron Roth and Sampath Kannan at UPenn. So in this work, what I want to do is to look at pipeline decisions. So we want to look at decisions that are made along a pipeline, and this pipeline may be comprised of several decision makers. And the pipeline that we're going to look at more specifically is the following. We're going to assume that we have several high school student populations that first have to go through university admissions and then later on are going to go on the job market. And so here we want to take the point of view of the university and ask the following question. So why would the university use affirmative action? What is the university trying to achieve here? And the answer that we're proposing is that maybe the university is not only trying to achieve the classical goal of having fairness at the admission level and correcting for past inequalities, maybe the university actually also wants to guarantee that fairness is going to happen later on down that job market pipeline. So why is affirmative action a way of doing so? Well, the way the college or the university is going to admit students is going to affect how decision making is going to be done down the job market pipeline. You can imagine that a university that admits every student apply to it might not, the employer might think that the average quality of a student in that university is not so great and not be willing to hire them, versus if the university is very selective, the employer is going to see that the university is very selective and is more likely to hire students from that university. So here's the scenario we're going to look at. We're going to focus on two high school populations. The students in those high school populations are going to take a standardized test, like the SAT. And this test is going to be an imperfect measure of their qualification level. Their SAT score is going to be reported to the university or the college. The college is going to decide how to admit students based on this score. And where affirmative action is going to come in is that we're going to allow the college to use different admission rules for different populations. Then the college is going to grade students or give them a transcript. The employer is going to see this transcript and make hiring decisions based on those grades or transcript. But we're also going to assume that the employer is going to see what population the students are coming from and what the college admission rule is, and use this in their decision making. So remember that our goal here is to establish fairness down the job market pipeline between those two high school populations. We're going to look at two notions of fairness here. The first one is equal opportunity. And all that is saying is that if two students have the same qualification level, they should have the same probability of going through the whole pipeline, so going from high school to being hired by the employer, and that should not depend on what population they're coming from. The other definition we're going to look at is what we call irrelevance of group membership, or IGM for short. And here we're saying that conditional on being admitted to college, so after you've been admitted to college, if you have two students that have the same grade, have the same performance in college, they should not be treated differently by the employer independently, regardless of what their population is. And that second definition is a bit more restrictive because it's saying I only care about the students that have been admitted to my university. I don't care about the other high school students. So let me give you a more formal version of the model. We're going to assume that the students in the population have a type. This type in population is going to be population 1 is going to be taken from distribution D1, and population 2 is going to be taken from distribution D2. Then the SAT score is going to be a noisy but unbiased here estimate of the type through addition of Gaussian noise to the student's type. The college is going to use threshold admission rules, so basically going to admit students if their SAT score is high enough, and we're going to allow the college to use two different thresholds for the two different populations. Then the grade is, as the SAT score, is going to be an unbiased but noisy estimate of the type. And finally, what the employer is going to do is the employer is going to do a base update. The employer is going to compute the expected type of a student given that the student has been admitted to college, given that he knows what population the student is from, and given the grade or the transcript that he's seeing about the student. And he's going to say, well, if this expected type, expected qualification level is high enough, I want to hire these students. So the good news in this model is that, so the first good news is that if you're assuming that your SAT is noise-free, so the variance of your SAT test is 0, which is, I know, a very unlikely model, but in this case we can achieve both of our definitions of fairness at the same time. We can actually still have this good news in a more reasonable model. You could look like at a business school type model in which you're allowing the university not to have a final grade or transcript. And in this case, you can show still that you can have both definitions of fairness guaranteed at the same time. Now, if you absolutely must give grades or transcript to your students, you can show that we can still achieve IGM. On the other hand, the bad news is that in that same model in which the SAT is noisy and you must give grades to students, you cannot achieve equal opportunity. And even worse, if as the university you don't actually know exactly what the employer is going to be doing, you don't know what cutoff on the type they're going to be using for their hiring decisions, and then you can't do anything. You cannot achieve any of our definitions of fairness. So let me conclude on some of the limitations of our work and future directions they would like to explore. First thing that you might have noticed is that we have static types. Those types are not going to change over time. Those types are just going to be the type, the qualification level of the student at the moment they're applying to college. That means we're actually not looking at correcting for past discrimination in this work, and that means we're not taking the student potential or the ability to get better into account. Kind of related to this point, we're assuming that the college is basically just a signaling device to the employer, but the college is not adding any value to the students. So a student does not come out of college any better than he came in. And in practice, you would like to model that college is actually adding value and making the students better. Third important point is that we're assuming that our tests and grades aren't biased. And we know that in practice, advantaged populations may be better prepared to take such tests. We know that such tests can be biased towards certain populations. And so an important future direction would be to model this and have basically biased test scores and SAT scores where the bias depends on the population. And finally, in this work, we've been looking at exact notion of fairness, saying if you have exactly the same type, you should be treated exactly the same way. And we get, and this is a bit restrictive, and we get a lot of negative results, but we were hoping that if you're allow for approximations of your definition of fairness, you might be able to get positive results here. And that's all I had to mention today. Thanks for listening, and thanks for staying until the end.
Okay, let's take the first question.
Hi, quick question for Lily and Smithy, I think it's right. Sorry.
No, you're good.
Did you fully consider the strategic abilities of the, let's say, university in this case, admitting students, and the fact that they might consider differential thresholds? Seems like that could be a possibility to adjust for the differential costs for the two groups. So maybe in both the papers, maybe you could talk about that.
Yeah, in our setting, we did consider that you use one classifier for both groups, but you could imagine sort of doing a similar thing to what some fairness criteria propose and adjusting for different groups. That I think is totally possible. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, next question, please.
Hi, my question is for Smitha also. In practice, how do you detect strategic behavior?
That's a really great question. I don't think people really know how to do it well in practice either. But I mean, there's lots of these micro-lending startups now, for example, right? And there are some studies and even scholarly papers trying to look at gaming in these situations, but it's very context dependent. And a lot of what I know that people do in practice, some hiring startups as well, is just sort of retraining their classifiers over time to make sure features are still correlated. Yeah, so it's hard to say. It's pretty context dependent, I would say. And it is a hard research problem, though, is how do you detect this in the first place? Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, a couple of questions from the other side.
Yes, I have a question to the third speaker. So it would be Hussein, Mouzannar, and the team. I was pretty shocked to hear the conclusion that affirmative action somehow disadvantages diversity groups in the long term. So I'm curious to hear the logic behind your methods and behind your conclusion, as well as how you propose, how you envision alternative measures that would promote social justice and address the historical cyclical inequalities that people face, and the fact that our society is characterized by power imbalance and the imbalance of access to resources. So for example, individuals from privileged communities have opportunities. They have mentors. Sometimes they get jobs based on who they know or who recommended them and so on. So they never even have to go through the formal competition, whereas other individuals, as you know, might have to be in the pile with 400 or 500 other applicants. Thank you.
So the end conclusions, there are two sides of the coin. So with under-acceptance, okay, you might lead to a worse-off equilibrium. However, what you really hope, what we really want is not just equality, we want beneficial equality. And this could be achieved with over-acceptance. And so if really accept unqualified individuals, which is what we think about affirmative action. And really show that, okay, it might not always happen, but when it does, it really leads to this better equilibrium. So we could achieve this better diversity. And asking about, okay, what can we do other than affirmative action? Well, really, this is my last point. So if we really understand the dynamics that underlies our system, we really have knowledge of this, we could probably design policies that just look at these dynamics and see, okay, if I do this now, how could I influence my population if I look at one step, two step, and drive society to possibly a better place. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, next question, please.
Hi, I'm Anna from Colombia, and my question is for Smitha and Lily mostly. And I'm wondering if you consider the action of like an external agent to perhaps help with the disparity in the cost. So I'm thinking of a solution-based approach, whether you're thinking about someone or an agency, for example, who would minimize the cost for a disadvantaged group. Do you think minimizing the cost in itself would help with the disparity that you find and with the trade-offs?
Yeah, so that was that second part when I was talking about subsidies really quickly. And yeah, so I think the surprising result that we had was that paying the potential subsidy, so say a voucher or something to particular populations to help them gain access to, say, if we continue with the SAT example, say test prep, does actually have or can have this unproductive effect, because I think maybe intuitively we might think of it as underestimating the various types of obstacles that social populations might face to achieving manipulation, so being able to act on this test prep courses. So you might think that a decision maker might offer a subsidy and then think, oh, well, given that this person had the opportunity to take test prep courses, now I'm really going to expect them to do really well on the SAT, right? And so you might think that that expectation could actually work against the seeming positive effects of giving a subsidy.
Thank you. Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay, we have time for one more question.
Thanks for the excellent panel. Just very broad question, maybe for the entire group. My general concern with this work is that we haven't even contemplated the possibility that people might make investments that change underlying quality, right? So the difficulty has been the difficulty of signaling. Like, how do you actually get the proper features to actually signal your true underlying quality? But in pretty much all the settings that are considered, there's also a very real possibility that we make investments that change the underlying quality, and that some of the programs we're considering aren't just also ways to bring in new populations, but genuinely change people's ability to perform certain tasks, such that we don't even have to question whether once you graduate from college that you were in fact equally qualified as someone who would have been admitted under a different threshold at the start. So I just want to ask questions about how we actually model changes in people's qualities due to investment.
I think this is a really great question and a subtle point, and this relates to the difference in metrics that I hinted at between expected cost of recourse and our measure of social burden. The reason that we don't consider the setting that you're considering of actually being able to change your true label through adaptation is because most machine learning classifiers that we use in practice are not causal. For people who know it, sort of a succinct way to put this is the ubiquity of Goodhart's law kind of indicates these are not causal. And to go back to like the example I showed in the beginning of the lending classifiers, maybe the easiest way for you to receive a loan is to open credit cards. So the reason that we only look at social burden for people whose true label is y equals 1 is because for positive individuals, this is clearly a cost. It's some kind of signaling cost, and this doesn't change the fact that they already are creditworthy. On the other hand, for people who are negative to begin with, opening up more credit cards does not improve your outcome. And therefore, it's unclear. There's been a lot of recent work showing, and here, like that you don't necessarily want to give loans to people who don't actually won't actually repay their loans for the long term. So because of just the way that machine learning models operate right now, we don't take into account the causal question. I know that there's some work, I think John Kleinberg's on the paper that looks at this, but in practice, I just think it's not really the issue that's going on. Yeah.
Can I say something to that as well? I think this is a really good point, because if it is the case that manipulation actually leads to improvements, then we're almost at a more troubling, conclusion, which is to say the real problem is not just leading to inaccurate signals, but actually the manipulation is allowing for fundamental changes in, say, what the opportunities that people really need to grow and flourish in the various ways that we want them to in a society. So that's like more troubling. And then I think the second thing we might learn from that is how limiting it is to have the machine learning framework, in fact, at all, because then you're saying, well, the fact that it was predicted on this previous static variable, I mean, it's kind of giving away the game when you're like, in fact, these variables are dynamic, these variables are fundamentally, oh wait, there's no sense in which they're finalized at any point in our developments. So it's a more damning conclusion, perhaps.
Okay, we have some closing remarks, but let's thank all the speakers again.